Good morning, OLLI at Berkeley. Welcome. Today, we are at our Berkeley Friday special events series. And today's talk is part of our America's Unfinished Work focus. And it focuses on the eradication of systemic racism in order to create a more humane, just, and equitable society. We're very happy to welcome Catherine Ceniza Choy to our talk today. And the title of her talk is How Did We Get Here? Violence in Asian American Histories. Catherine Ceniza Choy is Professor of Ethnic Studies and an Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Belonging, and Justice at UC Berkeley. She's the author of the books Empire of Care, which is about Filipino nurse migration, and Global Families, about Asian international adoption in the US. Her new book, available from Beacon Press in their Revisioning History series, is entitled Asian American Histories of the United States. Please join me in welcoming Professor Catherine Choy.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Matt, for that introduction, and thanks to you and all of the organizers of this event and series at UC Berkeley OLLI. It's really a pleasure to be in your company, and I appreciate this hour that we have together. Today, what I'm going to do is talk about the book as a whole, what it does, and why I wrote it. And I'll give a brief reading from the introduction of the book, and then discuss some of the unique aspects of the book's approach and subject matter. And I'll just conclude briefly with my hopes for the book. So the book, Asian American Histories of the United States, is a nearly 200-year overview of Asian migrations, labor, and community formation in the US. And Matt, in the introduction, had mentioned that I had authored previously two books. Empire of Care, my first book, explored how and why the Philippines became the world's leading exporter of highly trained nurses to the Western world, and especially the United States. And Global Families was a history of Asian international adoption in the US, beginning with the post-World War II and post-Korean War international adoption of mixed race Japanese and Korean children, and how this particular group became a pioneering group that transformed the United States into an international adoption nation. Both of those books, there was a lot of depth in terms of going in detail regarding unique aspects of Asian American historical experience. And so a bit different from those books, Asian American Histories of the United States provides quite a bit of breadth of this experience. I started writing the book before 2020, before COVID-19 became a pandemic. In many ways, the book is a reflection of my over 20 years of teaching Asian American history and Asian American studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities first, and then at UC Berkeley, where I have been since 2004. And as I write in the preface, I wrote the book with an intense sense of personal urgency. And in fact, I titled the preface, Writing in the Years of Great Hatred. I experienced, like so many Asian Americans, a lot of fear and anxiety given the surge in anti-Asian hate and violence that was related to the novel coronavirus. And we had experienced really dual existential crises, a deadly pandemic in the form of COVID-19, but also this fear and uncertainty of whether or not we would become targeted and blamed for this disease. There are some statistics, and in March of 2020, many of us were struck by the opening of the reporting center and nonprofit organization Stop AAPI Hate, which had started recording in March of 2020 at least 100 hate incidents per day that were being self-reported by Asian Americans. And recent statistics that we have from AAPI data as one source have pointed out that in 2021, 1 in 6 Asian Americans experienced some kind of hate incident, which was an increase since 2020. And then it's not solely the statistics, of course, that matter. I think we were inundated with many stories about violence, anti-Asian hate and violence in the media. And so there were stories from all over the country, such as the knife attack of a Burmese American family in Texas, an attack blaming them for this disease, to the very brutal attack of a Filipina immigrant, Vilma Carey, in broad daylight in front of a luxury building in Manhattan, to another elder, Juanito Falcon, who was pushed and hit and died as a result of his injuries. This is Juanito Falcon in Arizona. And so some of these attacks have been fatal. I think of Thai immigrant Vicha Ratinapakdi, who also suffered a very forceful shove and died as a result of his injuries from that in San Francisco. So I wanted to read from the introduction to give you a sense of the overview of this book and what it contains. And the title of this introduction is The Multiple Origins of Asian American Histories. And even though I had started thinking about multiple origins before 2020, the surge in anti-Asian violence certainly influenced the final version of this book. When and where does an Asian American history of the United States begin? There is no singular origin story that begins in one place and one time, and then progresses forward, smooth like silk, linear like thread. Rather, the origins of Asian American history are multiple. Asian American history begins in the here and now, as well as over 150 years ago in the mid-19th century. It begins in Asian continental lands and waterways, as well as urban, suburban, and rural areas of the United States. The Asian American experience stretches back as well as forward in time and space. It crisscrosses over time periods and over lands, oceans, and waterways. Where and when we enter are complex questions. And so I'll be reading a very much a abridged version of this intro. Asian American history begins in 2020 with the creation of the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center and the research finding that Filipino nurses in the US suffered a disproportionate and devastating toll from COVID-19. Asian American history begins in 1975 with the journeys of Southeast Asian refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia across land-based regions and rivers of Southeast Asian nations, and subsequently across all 50 states of the United States and their resettlement. US involvement in the Vietnam War and the secret war in Laos placed the lives of their Southeast Asian allies at risk. Thus, many Southeast Asian Americans are here in the US because Americans were there. Asian American history begins in 1968 with the emergence of the Asian American movement and its solidarity with the Third World Liberation Front. Their demands, their political consciousness, and even the language that they used to identify themselves were new. In 1968, UC Berkeley graduate students Emma G. and Yuji Ichioka used the term Asian American for the first time when they helped found the Asian American Political Alliance in Berkeley. Asian American history begins in 1965 with the passage of the Hart-Celler Act, also known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. In the 1960s, American legislators did not foresee how the Hart-Celler Act would greatly increase Asian immigrants, yet that is what it did. Asian American history begins again in 1965 with Filipino American agricultural workers and labor leaders initiating the Delano grape strike on September 8, 1965. The impact of the 5-year strike was profound. It catalyzed the modern farm workers' movement for fair wages, the right to organize, and the recognition of the dignity of their labor. Despite the formative role played by Filipino American labor leaders, such as Larry Itliong, in this strike, their contributions have been, for the most part, overlooked. Asian American history begins in 1953 with the international and interracial adoption of Asian children by American families. The plight of mixed race children born of Japanese and Korean women and American soldiers was the catalyst for this phenomenon. It transformed the US into an international adoption nation. International and transracial adoption and interracial romances of the 19th to the mid-20th century were precursors to the incredible heterogeneity of the Asian American population today. Asian American history begins in 1942 with the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. Their incarceration took place without due process. World War II was also a period of revolutionary changes for specific groups of Asian Americans as a result of wartime needs and US alliances with China, the Philippines, and India. These Asian Americans availed themselves of new employment opportunities, enlisted in the US military, and became Rosie the Riveters. Asian American history begins in 1919 with Korean delegates gathering in Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty. They wanted the American people to know that on March 1st, Koreans in Seoul had declared their independence from Japan. This early Korean American history intersects with the histories of Filipino immigrants who came to the United States as a consequence of US annexation of the Philippines, as well as the histories of Indian immigrants who fled British domination. Asian American history begins in 1875 with the Page Act, the US immigration law that prohibited the recruitment of unfree laborers and women for quote unquote immoral purposes. Although the law focused on the importation of prostitutes, it was enforced primarily against Chinese women. The Page Act illuminates a history of the US not as a nation of immigrants, but rather increasingly more like a fortress. Another troubling legacy of the Page Act is the objectification of Asian and Asian American women that persists to this day. Asian American history begins in 1869 with the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in the US. The event heralded US national progress and ingenuity. Chinese railroad workers constituted the bulk of the labor of the Central Pacific Railroad. And in one of the starkest examples of the erasure of Asian American contributions to US history, they were excluded from the photograph, celebrating the joining of the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads in 1869 at Promontory Summit in Utah. In 2014, photographer Corky Lee resisted this erasure by taking a photograph of Asian Americans, including descendants of the Chinese railroad workers, at Promontory Summit. The impact of this erasure runs deep. Over time, erasure would form an Asian American historical pattern. Tragically, it informs the present-day surge in anti-Asian violence across the US beginning in 2020 and continuing in 2021. The rise of verbal and physical harassment and violence against Asian American elders and women illustrate that this violence is tinged with the vulnerability of age and gender, factors that intersect with racist scapegoating in the age of COVID-19. Beginning in March 2020 and throughout the remainder of the year, President Donald Trump and other high-ranking US politicians referred to COVID-19 as the China virus and jokingly as the Kung flu. For Asian Americans, however, it is no laughing matter. For us, it can be and has been a matter of life and death. Thus, Asian American histories of the United States matter. Anti-Asian violence is a violence with a history. It is an outcome of a longer pattern of Asian Americans being treated as expendable objects. This is poignantly expressed in the ways many Americans do not see us as the central part of US history. And so Asian American activists, artists, and scholars do the work that we do in order to fight against dehumanization. We document and preserve, imagine and create, research and write our histories and humanity into being. And that's how the introduction ends, but this abridged version gives you a sense of the book as a whole. So now I want to talk about some of the unique aspects of the book, and I hope you get a sense of some of that from the excerpt that I had just read. One of the unique aspects appears already in the title, which is the emphasis on histories in plural, as opposed to Asian American history. And the reason why I did that was to honor the incredible diversity of our Asian American communities. This is the fastest growing community in the United States. And even though we say Asian American today, And it refers to, in general, an American with Asian ancestry, or for so many of us, a box that we can check off in a form. The term belies this incredible heterogeneity, and this includes diversity that comes from generational differences. This is a history that's almost 200 years old, and so it's not solely an immigrant history, but we have second, third, fourth plus generation Asian Americans, and so those incredible differences. There's also incredible diversity in terms of national origin. Prior to 1965 and the passage of the Hart-Celler, or Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that I had just alluded to, the major groups were Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, and Asian Indian American. And it was already quite a challenge to present a comprehensive and inclusive history of those groups. But since the passage of 1965 and exponentially increasing immigration, the Asian American community is now comprised of approximately 24 million people, hailing from over 20 countries, from East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent. And then there's the issue of not solely national origins and even more specific origins in Asia, but also regional diversity here in the United States. California and New York are states that are among the most well-known for having large Asian American populations, but Washington State, Florida, Texas, Massachusetts, Illinois also have large Asian American populations. And research has shown that states like North and South Dakota and North Carolina are also experiencing high growth rates of Asian American populations in their states. These are states that might not necessarily be the first that come to mind when we think about Asian America, but it gives us a sense of the incredible diversity and the incredible diaspora of Asian American populations just within the United States. Another major difference has to do with issues of socioeconomic class. And the Pew Research Center did research, and they found that looking at decades from the late 20th century and into the early 21st century, that Asian Americans have become the group with the most income inequality, meaning the largest gap between higher earning Asian Americans and those on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So you can have groups of Asian Americans living at the poverty line or in poverty at the same time that we can also bear witness to very high earning Asian Americans. This kind of socioeconomic class diversity was also referred to by sociologists as the dual nature sometimes, the dual nature of the Asian American community, especially after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, which favored the immigration of highly educated Asian immigrants with needed skills in the United States, often in health fields and technical fields, which partly explains some of the higher education and higher earning base of the population. But at the same time, the Immigration Act of 1965 also prioritized the immigration of family members who didn't necessarily have the same kinds of educational background and earning capability. Also overlapping with this post-1965 period is the post-1975 migration and resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees throughout the United States who were also struggling with getting employment for a variety of issues, including not knowing the English language initially. So this, in order to, I'm often asked this question, like, how can you bring together, let's say, a Cambodian refugee in the United States with a post-1965 Indian physician who is immigrating? And this is a good question. We are an incredible heterogeneous community. Asian Americans are not a monolith. And so the multiple origins tries to respect and honor this diversity, and to point out that there are different ways, different times, moments, events that bring us here. The second unique aspect of the book, which you got a sense of from the excerpt of the introduction that I read, where I say that Asian American history begins in 2020 first, and then 1975, and then 1968, 1965, 1953, 1942, 1919, 1875, 1869. And this is a non-chronological approach. Some people who have already read and engaged with the book describe it as a backwards moving history. And again, I'm also asked why I did that. And it's tied into the use of the plural of histories, where I felt that going backwards in time highlighted, emphasized that point, that where and when Asian Americans enter into the Asian American experience and US history are complex questions. And each of the chapters actually are titled by those years. And each of the chapters, for example, let's say the chapter on 1968, and the subtitle of that chapter is What's in the Name Asian American. Each of the years serves as a touchstone. The chapter's content does not solely focus on what happened during that year, but goes back in time, as well as forward into our present day. So one of the things that's unique about that chapter of 1968, What's in the Name Asian American, is that chapter talks about the Asian American movement and the creation of the term Asian American, which we may take for granted today, and which may have a slightly different meaning for many of us who are unfamiliar with where this term emerged in 1968. And I talk about how during that year, 1968 and 1969, the term Asian American, the Asian American movement was very much in solidarity with the Third World Liberation Front, so other social movements, and in solidarity with organizations such as the Black Student Union at San Francisco State University. But at the same time, I point out in that chapter how 1968 is not the first instance of Black and Asian American solidarity. And so part of that chapter goes back to 1869 and the orator Frederick Douglass's 1869 speech, in which he publicly was in favor of Chinese immigration to the United States and the naturalization of Chinese immigrants. He was saying this publicly during a time of increasing anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment. And then I go across time to even more recent moments, such as the creation of a project in which Asian Canadians and Asian Americans wrote letters for Black lives. So a different kind of resistance from public protest in the form of writing and gathering letters to be addressed to family and community members, to elders in their Asian Canadian, Asian American communities about the importance of being in solidarity with Black lives. Another key point in the book is that while I wrote with the intent to emphasize and honor diversity and multiple origins and many different kinds of Asian American histories, there are still themes, there are still experiences that bring our very diverse Asian American groups together. And the three themes that I emphasize in the book are violence, erasure, and resistance. And I'll talk about violence a little bit. Violence appears, the theme and historical experience of violence appears in every single part of the book. And one of the biggest challenges I faced in writing the book had to do with violence. I mean, it was emotionally, psychologically difficult to confront not solely the surge in anti-Asian hate and violence that was happening in our more present moment, but then having to confront again through just in the process of writing so many examples of, so many historical examples of anti-Asian violence. So the first chapter is titled 2020. And as I mentioned, when I read from the excerpt, I talk about the creation of the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center, and then a National Nurses United study, which revealed that Filipino nurses in the US were suffering a disproportionate and devastating toll from COVID-19. They comprise approximately 4% of the total US nursing workforce, but towards the end of 2020, they were comprising over 30% of US nurse deaths as a result of COVID-19. And in that chapter, I delve into some of the more contemporary forms of anti-Asian violence. And this included not only the egregious forms of violence that I opened this talk with, it's often the very egregious physical forms of violence that gain attention in mainstream news. But one of the contributions that Stop AAPI Hate and their reports created was that they collected all these stories of anti-Asian hate, some of which involved physical, excuse me, let me take a sip of water. Some of which involved physical acts of violence, but also involved things like shunning, not being addressed and helped at a store or a post office, experiencing for especially young people cyberbullying, as well as bullying in their schools, and being blamed for this disease. Another tragedy I talk about in that first chapter on the year 2020 in relation to Filipino nurses is the phenomenon of Asian American health workers, including Filipino nurses, having been targets of this anti-Asian hate and violence, even while they were wearing their medical uniforms. And I point out this paradox in the chapter, that this hate and violence is perpetrated against people who are literally dying trying to save our lives in the age of COVID-19. But in that chapter, I not solely talk about these forms of violence in 2020, but I connect it to a longer history of racial and medical scapegoating against Asian Americans. And so what we are bearing witness to since 2020 is not new. And that beginning in the second half of the 19th century, Chinese immigrants were blamed for bringing smallpox to the United States, were blamed for smallpox outbreaks in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we see that pattern. We see that pattern across groups with Filipinos in a U.S. In the Philippines, which was by the late 19th and early 20th century, a U.S. colony, Filipino bodies being characterized as incubators of leprosy, and Japanese immigrant farmers in California being blamed for the spread of typhoid, and South Asian, Asian Indian migrants being targeted for medical examinations of hookworm. So that association is quite old. It's not new. And even in the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century, Asian Americans, various groups resisted this kind of characterization, the stereotyping and scapegoating of themselves as disease carriers, because they knew that what was at stake was not solely their livelihoods, but also their lives. And so there are so many examples already beginning in that earlier period of anti-Asian violence. Some of the major ones include the 1871 Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, in which a mob of 500 people lynched 17 Chinese men, to the 1885 Rock Springs massacre in Wyoming, which resulted in the death of 28 Chinese men. So many examples of arson and looting of Chinatowns in Washington and Oregon Territory during this time, and the method of expulsion as a form of violence perpetrated against this pioneering group of Chinese migrants. And we see this repeated in 1907 with the expulsion of South Asian migrants in Bellingham, Washington, in 1913 of Korean migrant laborers in Hemet, California, of Filipinos in the 1920s and 1930s in Exeter and Watsonville in California. And we also see this carry through in the mid 20th century, the internment of Japanese Americans being accompanied by stories that parallel what is happening today, vandalism, name calling, looting, arson, theft, as well as physical violence. And then into the second half of the 20th century, as well as, of course, the 21st century. So in the chapter on 1975 about Southeast Asian Americans in the United States, the refugees who came in the post-1965 period from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were leaving and experiencing through their journeys tremendous violence through war, and then through their vulnerability as refugees undertaking oftentimes treacherous journeys. But even upon resettlement in the United States, they also faced violence. And I was struck by one report about the many different cases of anti-Southeast Asian violence in places like Massachusetts in the 1970s and 1980s, Texas, the arrival of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas in the early 1970s, partly in response to the growing population of Vietnamese refugees there, to North Carolina. Violence appears in the chapter in 1965 with post-1965 Asian immigrants who are sometimes often conflated with the stereotype of model minorities as being highly educated and high earners who are successful. But so many examples that it was challenging for me to include. In fact, I couldn't include all of them in that particular chapter. And then erasure and resistance. I touched upon erasure in the excerpt that I read with the erasure of Chinese contributions to the Trans-Pacific Railroad in 1869. Another form of erasure is with the impounding of the great documentary photographer Dorothea Lange's photos of Japanese American internment during World War II, which portrayed them as Americans and depicted a critique of what the United States government was doing to Japanese Americans during World War II with internment. To terms like the secret war, which was the term used for US involvement in Laos, and the term secret army to refer to the CIA's recruitment of Hmong Hill tribesmen to fight on behalf of the United States. Despite our incredible heterogeneity, these themes of violence, erasure, and resistance bind our experiences together. And I just want to conclude before we get into a Q&A in the last 15 minutes with my hopes for the book. I wrote the book with the hope that as broad an audience as possible would read it. And so readability was really important to me. The book is quite different from my previous books. It's written in the traditional third person, but also in the first and second person. And I also use some personal experiences in it. I do some, there's some interesting parts in the organization. In the middle of the book is an interlude that features contributions of Asian Americans to food and foodways in the United States. My hope is that you will read, engage, and share the book as widely as possible. So I appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Catherine. This is quite a lot to take in, quite a lot to think about. OLLI members, if you are comfortable hovering over the reactions tab at the bottom, you can use the raise hand function to ask a question and we will call on you, or you can type things into the chat and we can provide those questions that way. But perhaps while we're waiting, Catherine, you set up this distinction between a singular history and multiple histories. I wonder, if you think about this singular history, you're reacting to it. Is there a violence kind of embedded in that? Is there erasure embedded in that? I wonder if you could talk about why revisioning this is important.
Yeah, for me, well, most direct response to your question, which is a really terrific question, so I appreciate it. One, it was a response to there is what I've observed with some ways in which Asian American history tends to be presented or taught. Because it's such a diverse and growing group, it's really difficult to integrate so many different unique Asian American experiences within one book and one semester. And part of the challenge is that you want to show in a traditional sort of linear approach to this history how we get from A to B. But in doing that, it becomes difficult to integrate stories, histories, like the rise of Asian international adoption in the United States, or the growth of Filipino nurses on the front lines of American hospitals in these histories, because their histories are often beginning at a point back in time, whether it be 1898 or 1953, but then we don't see their presence in a very visible way until the late 20th, early 21st century. So the nonlinear approach enables us to try to break out of this like through line with a linear approach and say, why don't we just honor these histories on their own terms? And what would that look like? And so for me, it looks more like a nonlinear constellation of different multiple histories, but that are still connected through those three themes.
Yeah, thank you. Francis has his hand up. Rob, if we could go to him. Francis, you're on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I was just wondering if you might comment on how your book builds on or is different from or gives a different perspective from two other authors that I'm sure you know very well. Of course, Ronald Takaki's book that first was published in 1989 and then revised in 1998, Strangers from a Different Shore, A History of Asian Americans. And then the more recent 2015 book by Erica Lee, The Making of Asian America.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. First, I think it's important to read Asian American history as a whole. I hope you'll read all of their books, my book, and more, because there are more out there. I really see my work as certainly building. You know, I do feel this debt to Asian American history pioneers like Ronald Takaki, Gary Okihiro, Franklin Odo, who recently passed away. So without a doubt, building upon them, Erica Lee and I were colleagues at the University of Minnesota, and I have great admiration for what she has accomplished. That said, I do think Asian American Histories of the United States is distinct. I mean, it's written in a different moment in time. So there's a way in which the present day and what has been happening since COVID-19 really influenced the writing, the content, the approach of Asian American Histories of the United States in a way that Ron Takaki and Erica Lee, it was quite different because they were writing at different, points in time. Ronald Takaki's approach, one of the things that I appreciated about it is he's a master storyteller. So I try to use that, emulate his master full storytelling as much as possible. And I think though what's different is that Takaki also took in some ways a very group-based approach to honor the unique histories. And that's very difficult to do in the 21st century, given the size of our communities. So that's what's different. Erica Lee is a very prominent immigration history, and I think among the distinctions and strengths of her book are an immigration history approach and a very hemispheric approach also across the Americas. And I hope the strengths of my book are those that I emphasized in my talk and in my hopes for its readability to be shared across generations. And it is uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable at times to read this history, but we have to confront this violence and erasure in order to move forward in the most productive way. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. In terms of erasure, Linda has a question, and she wonders if there's any effort to have all UC Berkeley students read your book in order to help prevent or erase erasure.
I would love that. I am not aware of that at this point in time. The book just came out in August of this year. But I hope that will happen in the near future. Thank you so much, Linda. I'd love to see that very much.
Okay, and then there's a discussion going on regarding what it sounds like a kind of generational divide. So Maria asks, many of my friends and I are children of wealthy immigrant parents. Our parents can't relate to the history of Asian American discrimination and feel little connection to what's happened in the past. Do you have recommendations for how we can engage recent wealthy Asian immigrants to the US?
Well, there's some very straightforward things. I think, having a book club, an Asian American history studies book club that might include, my book and other history books, or might include genres that both your parents and you like, whether it's poetry or like the novel, and maybe reading something together like Asian Letters for Black Lives would be a great starting point. It's really difficult to have respectful, generative conversations these days. It's a lot of hard work, but I think that would be one place to start. And I think I've had my own differences, just even within my own immigrant, multi-generational family. And one of the things I was so touched by was how so many of my elder relatives read my book and said, you know, there's so many things like I didn't know. I just didn't know about these earlier experiences. And I think confronting our not knowing of one another's experiences is a productive way to start.
Let's move to a question and observation from Hugh. Hugh states, I can't help but conflate this excellent explication of anti-Asian experiences with America's history of anti-Semitism, anti-Black history, anti-Indigenous peoples history, and on, as a defect in the American mentality, and the opposite of America welcoming the stranger. I wonder if you could speak to this idea.
Well, I really appreciate how Hugh has is like making this connection with use the term defect. We could say that, you know, certainly like themes of violence and then erasure are themes that are shared by various groups in the United States who have been racialized as inferior and who have been dehumanized. And I'm currently teaching a course this semester at UC Berkeley on contemporary issues in comparative ethnic studies. And the course, the instructor picks a keyword. And so I chose the word pandemics. And in the course, we've been doing readings across different racialized groups about how they have been rendered inferior and less than human because of disease outbreaks. And I think this is one way that that shows how relational our histories are and how interconnected that they are. And we are still in the 21st century needing to learn this lesson that medical scapegoating does not work. Yeah.
So I would just make a note to folks. There's an interesting discussion going on in the chat about which books people could read. The chat goes away in a couple of minutes. So if you did want to make a note of some of these things that people are discussing, now is a good time. Perhaps we can move to Daniel, and this will be either our last or our penultimate question, but he has a practical question. He wonders what organizations and institutions are in place to combat prejudice and violence against non-white Europeans. Are there organizations that help to build solidarity among these non-white groups?
Yes, there are a number of organizations, but what I think what I want to point out is just, you know, I emphasize the work of Stop AAPI Hate, the Reporting Center, a nonprofit organization. And I believe that's an excellent place to start because one of the things we've observed, which is connected to the theme of erasure, is that Asian Americans at times, many times, get left out of discussions of discrimination, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice, and are sometimes thought of only afterwards or as an afterthought. And so I think it would be really important to think about organizations like Stop AAPI Hate or Asian Americans Advancing Justice or Center for Asian Pacific American Women, and the work that they're doing that centers Asian Pacific American experiences, but also in connection, in relation, and in collaboration with other racialized groups. Is there any way, Matt, we can save the chat?
Yeah,
Because I
Rob,
haven't
would you
been
mind
able
telling
to
folks?
see it.
Yeah, there is a way to do it. Rob, could you tell people how to do it if they want to? Because we really are at the 11:30 mark.
Yeah, if you want to save the chat, in this chat feature next to the happy face, there's 3 dots. If you click on the 3 dots, the first line is save chat, and that's how you save the chat. And as soon as the meeting's over, it will populate into your hard drive.
Okay, terrific. I want to thank everyone who's here and for your very thoughtful and engaging questions. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for joining us today. Good luck with this book. Good luck with your talks in the future. And everyone have a good rest of your Friday. Thanks for joining us.